Right, welcome. 1212. I am here live with Dr. Cassels. We're going to talk about these exploding healthcare costs and everything in the news recently. What do you say, Doctor? How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. I'm just, it's a beautiful day.
Yeah, I love it. Yeah, it's not bad here either. We were talking about Joe Biden here and how recently it's coming out. He's got this cancer that's really far along, the prostate cancer into his bone marrow. And you were mentioning how there's just no way that they didn't know about this for a long time now. Is that right?
Well, there, it depends on which lie you want to believe. The idea that he is recently diagnosed with advanced stage young man's kind of prostate cancer because you don't get to be 82 years old and have Gleason 9. That's just not possible um, uh, without knowing about it. So he's recently diagnosed, which means Dr. O'Connor, who's not an MD, he's an osteopath. He didn't test him for it. He didn't think about it. He didn't do a prostate exam. He didn't do a PSA test. He didn't ask him how he's feeling. He didn't do any test whatsoever for a disease. When you're 80 years old, 80% of men have prostate cancer. At 70 years of age, 70% of men have prostate cancer. So the default position is he's got it. The question is how much does he have? What does he have? And all that. So it's an absurd notion to have a press release saying that he has metastatic prostate cancer, stage 4, the worst stage, and Gleason 9 out of 10. Gleason 9 means that there are neurological elements within the cancer cells, which means that the cancer cell doesn't even look like prostate tissue anymore. It now is looking like something wild and completely different if it's got neurological elements in it. Gleason 8 is survivable because it doesn't have that degree of cellular randomness or in other words, neurologic elements. Uh, but Gleason 9 is not survivable. So you never see it as a de novo diagnosis. It just doesn't happen. Now, they also say it's hormone sensitive, which means, of course, that he could have been just given a little bit of a standard antifungal drug called ketoconazole. He could have been given that 3 months ago, and if it's hormone sensitive, he would not have detectable cancer now. You'd have to go biopsy something and look at it to find the cancer. But they didn't do that. They didn't give him ketoconazole, a pill with almost no side effects except that it drives down your testosterone. The whole story is not believable. They either have been lying for 10 to 15 years, as Ezekiel Emanuel said, or they're lying now, or they're lying then and now. But one way or another, it's simply not a believable story. And there's no credible doctor believes the story coming out of the press, the Biden press machine. Now it's not credible. It's not believable. And if there's any element of truth to it, quite obviously this is the most severe case of elder abuse that and malpractice that anybody has ever seen. It's prima facie malpractice if in fact he has seen a doctor within the last 15 years.
It's just unbelievable, isn't it? And it seems like maybe this breaking this news. I think it was on Sunday.
Yeah,
Was meant to cover what came out late Friday. The Biden her interview, which of
yeah,
course goes into
yeah.
how they've been covering up who is really making the decisions there. We got the auto pen was used on everything. Who's calling the shots? Are we? And this is from the side claiming democracy, and it's like, well, who's in
Yeah.
charge here? Who did? It's not who we voted for.
Well, to give you a little background, I met Joe Biden when he was a councilman in 1972 when he was first running for the Senate, and he's been my neighbor in Delaware. Lived within a quarter of a mile from me in his one house, and then he moved to the other side of me about a half a mile away as the crow flies. So I've known him a long, long, long time. Met him many, many, many times. Know Jill, his second wife. I know Jill's first husband very well. Bill Stevenson's a good friend of mine. I published his book about what Joe had done to him. So I don't have much good to say about Joe. I never liked him. He never paid his medical bills. He stiffed everybody he could. He's always been disparaging about doctors. But even as somebody who has found, I've thought for 50 years that he is a very, very bad man. He's angry. He's dishonest. He's never met a lie he didn't like or espouse. There's just nothing good I have to say about him. But even I feel sorry for the guy when they trotted him out. When he clearly is a different human being, he's clearly got dementia, and he clearly has been treated badly medically. So, I mean, even I feel sorry for him, and I don't have anything good to say about the man.
Oh, it's wild. Yeah, did you see the tape where he's looking like a foot taller than usual? You talk about him not even being the same man. That's a whole nother rabbit hole, but
Well, I mean, he was stone cold bald, except for a little bit on the sides here, 40 years ago. So they've taken all this hair from the back and they've plugged it out front, which is why Rush Limbaugh called him plugs. None of his teeth are real. I know the orthodontist and the dentist that took care of him, and he stiffed them. He didn't pay him. So, I mean, he's just fake, fake, fake. His education's fake. His degrees are fake. His total history is fake. It's just, but beyond that, he's mean. He's a really vindictive guy. You should read the book, The Biden Brothers, by Jill's first husband, Bill Stevenson. You can get it on Amazon, and just tells what he did to his he to Jill's first husband. Took his wife and then tried to ruin his life for decades.
that's wild. I hadn't heard about that. Yeah, it's
No, no,
amazing
it's
that.
all real. And then, of course, I wouldn't let my kids go anywhere near his kids because they're disasters, you know?
Yeah, that's been apparent. Is that crazy? Joe Biden, his son Hunter Biden, right? That whole laptop coming out, that would have totally swung the election back in 2020. And then, the censorship that we saw about that. You couldn't post about it. You couldn't. Not only could you not like link to it, you couldn't even just
Oh, yeah.
reference it or mention it. And yeah, so this kind of top-down control when it comes to the First Amendment, it's just
Well, that's
crazy.
amazing. It's amazing that Hunter really, in fact, was running the White House. I mean, it was his playground. I mean, actually, I don't think it was Hunter's cocaine. I think it was actually Ashley's cocaine that they found there. I think Hunter was so sacrosanct that the Secret Service knew to stay away from Hunter and everything to not find cocaine. But Ashley mistakenly put it in a locker, his sister. So,
Of course, right? Yeah. That's wild. I didn't know they were in the White House so much. I thought they would have kind of been kept at arm's distance. Interesting.
oh no, I think it's their playhouse.
That's wild. Oh my gosh. Well, Doctor, I was really taken with your speech at the Healing Science Policy Institute a couple weekends ago in DC. You spoke about how our healthcare costs have just been exploding, and you identified the root of it. That it's all been stacked upon. And so yeah, I wanted to ask you to share about that a little bit.
Sure. Okay, so my background is that of a surgeon. So whenever something goes wrong in an operating room, what you do is if you want to get better, if you want to, it to never happen again, because ultimately in an operating room, the surgeon necessarily takes responsibility for everything. If somebody sneezes in the corner, and somebody else gets a cold or the patient gets sick, that's the surgeon's fault, even though he didn't sneeze. So what happens is you look back for the index error. Where did the trouble start? Because once the trouble starts, you're playing catch up. You're trying to fix this, fix that. And the more you try and fix things, the more likely things are off the rail and you're going to have to fix more and more and more stuff. So I always look for the index error. So where did we go wrong in medicine? And there are lots of different ways to look at it. You can start by saying that medicine is a sort of a curiosity in human culture. We're unlike a lot of other groups of animals in that we take care of the weak and vulnerable in our midst. We don't walk away from the injured and let the lions, tigers, and bears go ahead and go over the carcass. We bury our dead. We drag our wounded around with us. We wait for them to heal. We have archaeological digs 100,000 years old where we find evidence of a healed femur fracture. That's the thigh bone fracture. Well, the average time to healing of that fracture, particularly if it's an open fracture or a compound fracture, is about 11 months. So if this fracture healed, quite obviously the tribe 100,000 years ago dragged this guy around uh, for a long period of time, months on end, before he could heal. So that's not something that other animals do. So that's a little curious because that's not really a commerce. I pay you, you do this for me, you do this for me, I do that for you, you pay me this, I pay you that. The standard give and take commerce. It's a little different from that. And medicine is like that.
I've heard this identified as maybe the start of civilization is when you see this that bone healed that way, that people taking care of each other that way,
Yeah.
really separating us from the animals, like you say.
It does. It very definitely does. So there's something going on here that's not straightforward business commerce. We also can be savage and, of course, wipe each other out. But does it go to there? Does it go to Hippocrates, the father of medicine? Does it go farther back to the guy that Hippocrates worshipped, a guy named Asclepius? He was so famous in Greek history for driving out the snakes, which is this thing you see over and over. You see it with St. Patrick, Moses, Jesus. Everybody drives out the snakes. It's this thing you do with a stick to pull a worm out of a leg. But anyway, so we're at least 2,000, 3,000 years BC when this idea of taking care of the weak and vulnerable is institutionalized. But that's not really where it all goes wrong. You could say it goes wrong with the beginning of socialized medicine, which in the modern era really goes to Bismarck when he formed the country of Germany from all of the little city states. Out of Bismarck, he put forward the first plan of socialized medicine because it was cheap to take care of people, and people didn't live very long. They didn't live long enough to get sick. Maybe it was the British health system in 1911. Maybe I'm not sure. But what I point to is when we started to get medical inflation in this country. Medical inflation begins in 1942 when we put in place a wage and price freeze. Franklin Delano Roosevelt did this the latter part of the World War II, but really before we were much involved in it. But he froze wages and prices, and he told employers, you may not pay people more because we are going to have to ramp up our war effort here, and we don't want inflation to mess with that. So you can't pay people more. And the employers said, well, how are we going to retain good people? And FDR gave them a perk. They said, okay, we will let you give people benefits, including a pension. You can give them a pension, and that shouldn't be too inflationary. We'll let you give them health insurance. Health insurance was a brand new idea, largely Blue Cross. And Blue Cross was meant to defray the cost of hospital stays. Now, to give you an idea, in 1942, a, a 7 day stay in the hospital for a new mother, so mother and baby, mother comes in, has the baby, stays in the hospital 7 days. So for 6.5 of those days, it's mother and baby in the hospital. I have a copy of a bill from our local hospital for that 7 day stay for mother and baby, $42. Oddly, in 1942, it was a $42 bill for a 7 day stay. So and I sort of kept that bill because it's comical. Wage and price freeze comes in. People all of a sudden get health insurance. Now you go to your doctor, you go to your hospital, you go to your emergency room, and you say, I don't really care what it costs. You want to get an extra test, get an extra test, whatever, because I'm not paying for it. My insurance company's paying for it, and my employer's paying for my insurance. So there's this disconnect to where all of a sudden people can get health care for free. Well, you're at the all you can eat buffet and it's free. So you pile up your tray with a lot of food because everything's free. Well, that works as long as you're employed because there's only people who were employed who got this benefit called health insurance. Well, what about people who stopped working? Retirees, and retirement was a new concept then because Roosevelt didn't really have an understanding of the idea of retirement. Retirement did not happen back in the early 1940s. You worked and died, and you died at somewhere around 60, 61, 62 years old. So retirement wasn't a thing. But now people were retiring. They were retiring. They didn't have health insurance anymore. But since the hospitals didn't care about how much they were billing people because nobody was complaining about the bill, it got more and more and more expensive. Hospitals started charging $400 for a week in the hospital, and then it was $400 a day, and then it was $4,000 a day, and so forth. So you can see where the inflation hits very hard. Now all of a sudden you have a lot of old people. People start living longer because we invented penicillin during World War II and a lot of other things like that. You're not dying of infections. People started living. We had invented the Pap smear, so women weren't dying of cancer early on. This has totally changed all the demographics. But all of a sudden, there are these old people out there, and their cost of medicine has gone skyrocketing up because of all these employed people who don't care what it costs. So you have to do something. So you invent Medicare. We're going to take care of these old people. We're going to make young people who are working pay for Medicare, sock away the money. And now old people don't care what it costs because they're not paying for it. Medicare is paying for it, which means that doctors and hospitals can now charge whatever they want because, after all, nobody's complaining. Medicare is paying for it. That's a hyperinflationary effect on healthcare costs. Well, now you've got Medicare. What about poor people who aren't part of the workforce? Well, we better cover them too, so we'll invent Medicaid. And then, well, that leaves out poor children. Let's invent children's health or CHIP, children's health program. And then we layer on some other odds and ends sort of things. Well, what about veterans? Well, we'll do something for them too. We'll do Veterans Administration. And then, well, what about people in the military currently? Well, we'll invent Military Health Service, MHS. And then we'll invent, well, what about the people on the reservation, the Native Americans? Well, we'll invent Indian Health Service. And so what you have is all these institutional things get in the way, and they start paying for all the health care. So nobody really cares what it costs. That's a hyperinflationary pressure. It makes everything cost more and more and more and more and more. So let's go to the most extreme case of government sponsored healthcare, cradle to grave. You're born on the Indian reservation in Oklahoma. You live on the Indian reservation, you die on the Indian reservation. You don't come in and out of Indian health services. You're in it. Cradle to grave. The government takes care of you from the beginning, from before you're born, with prenatal care, through your birth, through your childhood, through your school years, through your working years, through your old age. If you look at people on IHS or Indian Health Services, their average length of life is 11 years shorter than the rest of us. So there you have the purest example of cradle to grave government healthcare, and you're losing 11 years on average. Now, I mean, you know, John, if you came to me and said, I have this demographic group, these are people with orange skin, and people with orange skin on average live 6 months less than the rest of us. I, as a scientist, would say we better look into that. There's something going on here that we better find out about. 6 months less than average, that's big. Try 11 years.
That's wild, isn't it? That's
11
unbelievable.
years.
And
That's a
it's not genetic,
catastrophe.
right? If
What?
they're not on the reservation, they're living just as long as the rest of us, right? So
Right. Yeah. If they moved off of the IHS and they got over to Medicaid or they got over to Medicare or Blue Cross Blue Shield or Cigna or something like that, then they would have different health care. So, I've had the argument thrown at me, well, that's a poor example because after all, these are, Native Americans, they're Indians. And I'm saying, whoa, 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 wait, what are you saying? They're saying, well, they hit each other over the head all the time, and there's a lot of crime, and they drink too much. I said, well, those are kind of social diseases, aren't they? Shouldn't Indian Health Services be doing something about that? I mean, shouldn't they be intervening in the community to keep these people from hitting each other over the head or drinking too much? I mean, first of all, the comment is pure racism on its face. But then beyond that, again, you go back to the fact that it's a government control system and it's bad.
it reminds me of the quote, the most nine terrifying words in the English language are "I'm from the government and I'm here
Yeah,
to help." Right?
exactly. So the question is, how do you go about fixing this hyperinflation thing? Well, you invent HMOs, you end up doing this, that, or the other, you try and regulate the healthcare. You set prices, but it's all top-down stuff. And top down never works out well. You end up with what's called rationing of healthcare, and that's what's happened to all of the socialized medicine programs around the globe. It's happened in British Health Services. It happened in Germany. In Germany, it actually went so far as eugenics and the Holocaust. That's how they were trying to control their healthcare. The Canadian system, you have to wait a year and a half to see somebody about your arthritis in your hip, and probably 4 or 5 years to get a hip replacement. You got to wait a year or year and a half to get bypass surgery for your heart in Canada. Uh, Try living for a year and a half with unstable angina. That's why people run across the line to Rochester or to Mayo Clinic or to somewhere right across the border to get health care, and they just pay for it. Um, so at some level, you do have to reintroduce a free market system to bring quality up, bring access up, and bring costs down. So you've got to put the consumer back in control of their dollars, whether that's with a health savings account, as Scott Atlas has touted, or higher copays or something like that. But people have to be able to say to their doctor, to their hospital, is this the best you can do? I want something with better outcome numbers. I want something that doesn't hurt so much. I want something that doesn't cost so much. I want something that doesn't scar so much. But the consumer has to get involved to bring a lot of that down. And then beyond that, you have to hybridize it a little bit to account for simple humanity, which is that we take care of our weak and vulnerable and sick. We just do. We need a safety net. We need to take care of our children. We need to make sure they're not exposed to bad diseases. We need to, take care of somebody who, through no fault of their own, gets T-boned in a car accident. There are things we need to do as a society to validate our sheer humanity. But, you know, everyone can't have everything all the time for free because the economics simply don't work.
Oh, it just it's kind of obvious, isn't it? The idea that I like the way some people put it is that you know the government is, if you're going to say, hey, healthcare is a right, does that mean, at the force of law at gunpoint, we're going to make doctors, give healthcare? So,
Yeah,
this is something
yeah,
Ron Paul talked about, is that, we before we had all these systems in place from the government that are inefficient and, rife with fraud and abuse, like you said, we had, the church stepping up, we had civic organizations stepping up. So this is a
yeah.
natural thing that the people can take care of. We don't need, the government to step in. You know, what it is? What's the line? Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. So,
Sure. Well,
you know,
there's a great line from Rahm Emanuel's brother, Ezekiel Emanuel. You know, the three brothers. One, Rahm Emanuel, became mayor of Chicago after running the Clinton White House, and then Ezekiel, who's a pediatric neurologist at the University of Pennsylvania, but he was one of the authors of Medicare, not Medicare, of Obamacare. And they have a third brother who's a big time producer in Hollywood. But anyway, Ezekiel was being interviewed about the time of Obamacare. So this is 2008, 2009 era. And he's being interviewed by Bill O'Reilly, if you remember. Um, and Bill O'Reilly says, well, what are you going to do with the doctors when you're not paying them anything anymore? They'll just stop working. And Ezekiel Emanuel says famously, "Oh, they'll work. We'll make them work." And I saw that on television, and I thought, "Oh, really?" Well, just to give you an idea, when I retired at the end of 2019, and I had 10 years to plan for my retirement, 10 years because I saw Obamacare and realized there's no way I can continue to be a self-employed doctor under Obamacare. Can't happen. The deck is stacked against me. So when I retired at the end of 2019, I was the last self-employed orthopedic surgeon in the state of Delaware,
wow.
the last one. That's what, 5 years ago. So the truth is, no, the doctors don't have to work. By and large, doctors are a very smart population, very well educated, very entrepreneurial in many ways, also very good-hearted, but they don't have to work. Most of them have the wherewithal to retire or go do something else. And so that's what happened. And so now you have a dramatic shortage of doctors, and you can't simply turn a switch and replace them quickly. It takes between 15 and 20 years to educate a doctor before you let him go out and practice medicine on people. So you can't just, I mean, they can retire with a flip of a switch, but they can't be produced with a flip of a switch.
You know, this problem of so many doctors now, you know, having to go along with the guidelines, you know, we saw during COVID, right? So many couldn't prescribe ivermectin. Few standouts, a few courageous ones
Yeah.
did. But what was it about Obamacare that made it so hard for guys like you to stay in business?
Yeah, mostly it was onerous regulation, oversight, compliance issues. I mean, for instance, they put in place not one, not two, but three different practice management guidelines that you had, not guidelines, practice management software packages that you had to comply with. You had to load all of this data in about every single patient so that the government could track and see if you were doing everything you were supposed to be doing and everything that you were billing for and yada yada yada. Well, each of those software programs cost in excess of $100,000. Well, as an independently self-employed physician, I couldn't afford one of those programs, much less three of them. So I could not possibly be in compliance with Obamacare. Since I wasn't in compliance with Obamacare, they cut me my payments from Medicare over a course of 10 years by 5% per year. So you literally do not have that kind of margin to pay your employees. Now, I timed it pretty well, ending all my contracts. So the last 9 months of my practice, I simply didn't draw a paycheck, so I could continue to pay my employees, and I could, shut the practice down. But I had inherited the practice from my father, so it was 70 years of medical records, 70 years of taking care of people. It was a lot to unwind.
Wow.
But for 9 months, I simply didn't take a paycheck, but I timed it pretty well. A lot of people just simply went bankrupt. They just had to leave, but you couldn't possibly comply. And then, of course, the idea that the same formulaic best practices is correct for all patients is patently absurd. Yes, there's some general guidelines you should do it, but if you, Mr. Paradise, if I was to suggest to you that you have a pap smear every year for the health of your uterus, you would laugh in my face. That's because you're a man, not a woman. So right on the face of it, best practices is out the window. You can't treat women the same as men, and you can't treat old women the same as young women, and you can't treat children the same as old men. So none of best practices makes any sense at all. You have to individualize care for the individual patient, which means that the government doesn't know what the hell they're doing, never has, never will.
That's wild, isn't it? It reminds me of what's going on in big agriculture, right? We're losing all of our small farms
Yeah.
to, this legislation that's just in favor of the big guys, right? So we're letting these industry interests, write the laws and get big or get out is pretty much the way things are headed. And then this is just the opposite of a free market, right? So, when you're small, you're nimble, you're quick, you can
Yeah.
serve people better, be there and provide what's needed. And these this top down, especially in the time we're in now, with so much changing with AI and the way things are heading. For the corporations and the government to stay flexible, this is something that they're not really good at. So yeah, it's really putting us behind the eight ball when it comes to keeping up with the economics of everything.
Yeah, it's going to be the AI is going to be an interesting thing. I mean, on the one hand, probably 95% of medicine is very repetitive, and AI is going to be able to completely replace it. You're going to lose a huge number of people who simply aren't cost effective when AI rolls out. The problem is going to be that 5% where medicine's not ordinary, it's not routine, it's not predictable, and AI is going to struggle with that. And you're not going to have people with great experience and wisdom and longevity to be able to spot when things aren't exactly the way they ought to be. But now, having said all of that, because I think AI is going to make very, very few errors, and in general is going to be a huge benefit to the practice of medicine. Having said that, look at what they did under COVID when they started to manage information. They very, very quickly flipped from proper management of information into draconian mismanagement of information, and then abject lying, and then lying to cover the lying, and then lying to cover the lying to cover the lying. And you quickly saw all of our institutions unravel with this very small amount of money going to the actual individuals, but massive amounts of money going to pharma, to educate, to research all these things. It was a really scary example. I mean, within just a short number of years, you saw uh, abject fraud in CMS, Medicare and Medicaid, in the FDA, in NIH, in CDC, revered institutions. They suddenly followed the money and they did whatever. There was total regulatory capture by big pharma, by everything. The hospitals played along, and much to my dismay, the vast majority of doctors played along. They simply, I realize that doctors, while they have a scientific background and education, are also fundamentally pleasers. They wanted to please their grade school teacher. They wanted to please their high school teacher. They wanted to please their college professors. They wanted to please their medical school professors, their mentors, their everybody. The doctors are pleasers. And so they just went along with it. They bought in. And it was really embarrassing that the doctors didn't say, wait a minute, this doesn't smell right. Talking
You
about
talk about those
COVID, of course.
lies. Yeah, you talk about how they were covering one lie with another lie, and all the gaslighting, and
Yeah.
so many vaccine injured. Estimates are about 1 million serious adverse reactions here in the states. Different estimates, but and these people were abandoned, right? These people
Oh
were
yeah.
gaslit, told they have anxiety.
Totally gaslit.
You're in a wheelchair, you can't walk, and they're telling you it's anxiety, and it's just
Yeah.
unbelievable. So
Yeah. It's the spike protein is now in us and with us. And God bless people like Peter McCullough who have really the FLCCC doctors, Pierre Corey, Marty McCary, Jay Bhattacharya, these guys, they've really done. Um, Paul Merrick, Paul Merrick's done great work. He's part of the FLCCC in getting people on the nattokinase and then the other anti enzymatic naturopathic medicines that actually do clear the spike protein. Um, so I mean, it's gonna take some work, but yeah, there's a huge number of spike protein injuries, both from the COVID and from the vaccine out there, and we're just at the tip of the iceberg for eradicating it from society. I mean, the spike in pericarditis and myocarditis is just massive, massive number of young athletic kids who drop dead. I mean, it's just off the charts,
it
and
really is. And the crazy thing is, Pfizer's own study showed this, right? So five people died of heart conditions in the vaccinated group, and just one in the unvaccinated group.
yeah,
And so we saw that signal right away. And now,
yeah.
what is it?
By October of 2020, we had already collected. This is before the release of the vaccine, but we'd already collected 5,000 adverse events in the VAERS reports before the vaccine was even released. 5,000 is the magic number for killing a vaccine program. They just ignored it, and then they went to the CDC and demanded that the CDC change the definition of vaccine because quite obviously this particular medication, the COVID shot, did not prevent the transmission of the COVID-19, the coronavirus, from person to person, and it did not prevent you from getting the coronavirus infection. So it did neither of the things that are necessary for the definition of a vaccine. So they changed the definition of vaccine.
Right. And then it actually had a negative efficacy, right? You're more likely to get COVID, and if you're more
Sure.
likely to get it, then you're more likely to spread it. So
Yeah. Yeah. The whole thing will go down in history as the biggest medical hoax ever. And what's interesting is because we saw this hoax unraveling, we actually went back and began to think, hey, maybe this guy Bobby Kennedy was onto something when he's talking about autism. We went back and looked at the data and said, well, yeah, maybe there is something there. Maybe we're gaslighting him. Maybe Jonas Salk didn't really create the Salk Sabine vaccine. Maybe it really didn't work against polio. Turns out it didn't. Turns out the Salk Sabine vaccine was pretty much BS too. It is not responsible for the pullback of the polio virus. It was that happened naturally in the world of epidemiology and virology, and the Salk Sabine vaccine, as injected into the shoulder, did not work. It did have a little bit of beneficial effect if you took it by mouth in a sugar cube because it worked on the lymph nodes of the jejunum of the upper intestine, but and therefore worked at the mid level of the spine through the lymph nodes. But the injection that Salk and Sabine got the Nobel Prize from actually didn't work.
is that incredible?
But we never looked back at it. We simply gave him a prize. I met Jonas Salk once. It was interesting because he was married to Picasso's widow, and I tell you, she's a piece of work. I met
Is
I
that
met
right?
both of them at the Commonwealth Awards. He was a complete jerk, and she was the sexiest little French girl you ever met.
It's incredible.
She had been married to Picasso, then she married Jonas Salk.
One of the points I bring up to people about this all is that, the vaccine schedule, the whole liability shield, the idea that, there no other product, no other service has this, and they needed it because they were, harming so many kids and losing so many lawsuits. And their justification to Congress was, we're going to have to get out of the business. This is the same thing Monsanto is saying right now or Bears Monsanto is saying right now to Congress. They want a liability shield for pesticides. They're saying, and they're saying we're gonna have to pull this off the market. It's like, yeah, well, pull it off the market. You know what? We can grow our food without poison. Other countries
Yeah,
are growing
yeah.
their food without poison. You talk about the free market. You take away that liability. You're taking away our constitutional rights to due process, to stand up for our loved ones, for getting accountability, and we see how that goes off the rails very easily.
Well, you're talking about the EUA, the Emergency Use Authorization Act. Yeah, that's the act that that shields them from liability. But here's a little twist that you may not have picked up on. And maybe you probably know it, but you can automatically get an emergency use authorization and therefore complete product liability protection if you can convince the Department of Education to require school children to have that vaccine before they can go to school. That's a little clause in the EUA legislation. So we didn't need to vaccinate children against COVID. There is no case, and I mean 0.0000 cases of healthy children dying of COVID, and children did not pass COVID to children. Didn't happen. So there's absolutely no reason whatsoever to give them a vaccine. But there's this hard push by Pfizer and Moderna to get children on the list to be vaccinated, to get them approved for the vaccination. That's so they could force the teachers union to demand it of the Department of Education that children could not go to school without being vaccinated. Once they pushed that through the Department of Education, mandating children be vaccinated before they're allowed to go to school, now Pfizer and Moderna automatically have liability protection because of the EUA.
Right. That's exactly right. Yeah, so we're seeing that be rescinded here hopefully soon. Talking about that at the FDA.
Yeah, yeah.
Getting this, got to pull these shots, absolutely. I think it's like a triple crime against humanity, right? They made the virus in a lab. We got to shut down these labs to begin with. I think it's been said not a single good thing's come from the gain of function research, and I'd agree with that. And then why are they doing the gain of function research? Their justification is to make these vaccines. So they made the virus and they pushed these vaccines on us so that they made hundreds of billions off of, killing millions. Some estimates say up to 17 million. And then they hid the good treatments from us. Ivermectin, vitamin C, vitamin D, zinc, quercetin, all these things
Yeah,
that.
hydroxychloroquine amongst them. Nitroxenide, there are dozens of those sorts of things out there. There's a new study that just came out this past week that piperacillin. It's a slight early modification of penicillin. Piperacillin in minute doses, tiny minute doses, completely eliminates the chance of getting Lyme disease after a tick bite, completely cures Lyme disease, and completely cures long or chronic Lyme disease. Lyme disease, of course, being another one of the gain of function bugs that was released upon society from the Plum Island military bioweapons lab just across Long Island Sound from Old Lyme, Connecticut. That's where Lyme comes from, is the Plum Island bioweapons lab. Back in the 1970s. Where do you, that's and so, but piperacillin, tiny little dose of it completely cures it. A completely innocuous dose. So, I mean, if my grandchildren come in out of the field and then we pluck a tick off them, I'm giving them this tiny dose of piperacillin, and there's zero chance of them getting Lyme disease.
I hadn't heard of that. I got to look into that.
The research literally just came out this past week, was just published.
All
It's
right.
fascinating. I mean, the results are truly shocking, but it there's an awful lot there that's been hidden from us. So after we spoke at the conference, I went back and did my glyphosate research. I told you I wasn't up to speed. I had looked at it years ago, and I went back and looked at it, and I am sure that there are many, 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 many people who are vulnerable to it and have been injured by it. It's just it's a matter of scale, though, and so the question is, at what scale is it beneficial to society, and what scale is it? I think they used it too widely and too broadly and too indiscriminately, and eventually they got into problems with hurting a lot of people that they didn't necessarily have to.
Oh, it's incredible. We're using over 10 times what Europe's using. And they say up to 80% of our exposure is maybe coming from the fact that we are spraying it on our beans, on our grains at harvest to help dry them. So we're using it like a pre-harvesting desiccant. And so now instead of just spraying it to the ground to kill weeds, we're spraying it directly on like the chickpeas, the soy, directly on our grains, our oats. And so now, yeah, the exposure is just really intense. And this stuff is an antibiotic, right? That's what it's registered as. Clears out the gut microbiome, carcinogen, endocrine disruptor, and it chelates the nutrients. So now, our food is so nutrient deficient, and there's a lot of pathologies that come from that. There's a really wild chart. Of course, correlation doesn't prove causation, but it's our biggest clue. And this is from Stephanie Seneff's research on this, where she shows this just incredible correlation between really dozens of different conditions going up in lockstep with increased use of glyphosate, but autism especially. So this chart right here, this is a R value of 0.997. That is unheard of. And
Yeah.
so as we're using more of this, I do think vaccines are implicated big time in autism. And actually, we're seeing glyphosate get into the shots because the glyphosate's in the collagen. So the way that they, it's such a crazy cocktail of what they're doing when they're making these shots, but it's getting through into there. We're finding that, especially in the MMR vaccine. And yeah, so it's just wild what we're seeing.
Yeah. Well, pay no attention to that man behind the curtain. You know.
But this is exactly what this healing science policy was all about. Is the way that we are up against just all this corruption, all the gaslighting. We can't trust the peer-reviewed research anymore, right? Because they're paying the scientists. They tell them, hey, this is how we want the study to look, and they're getting their results. And then if they don't get this study to look the way they want, well, it just doesn't get published, right? So it's wild. Some of the quotes out there from these different editors of the Lancet and the British, the BMJ, and on, just saying, yeah, this is just, we got a real problem here. It's incredible.
One of the editors of the New England Journal famously wrote an op-ed in about 2017, I think, 2017, 17, or 18, referencing what you said there about correlation and causation, and that is a standard scientific and debate no idea that correlation does not necessarily prove causation. But in this editorial, this editor of the New England Journal of Medicine said, yes, but when everybody everywhere sees the correlation, it may not be prospective, it may not be double blind, it may not be the perfect study, but when 60,000 doctors all say I'm seeing this happen, and this, a good example would be COVID and treating COVID with hydroxychloroquine or ivermectin or some combination of hydroxychloroquine, and saying when tens of thousands of doctors all say this is working, even if you don't have a double-blind prospective study, you must take it seriously. You must. There is a level at which there is so much correlation that it becomes factually true, even without the idea of assigning causation to it. It nevertheless is true. And it was a famous and non-controversial op-ed in the New England Journal of Medicine before COVID happened, and when it was cited during the COVID outbreak, people just said, no, 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 we have to go to the double-blind prospective study.
This was something that Kennedy actually mentioned this last week on his hearing on the Hill. He was talking about a Cochrane study that, described that, observational studies can be just as good of a predictor of what's really working as, randomized control studies. And yeah, I think like 100-fold cheaper. So, they've got this bar of gold standard research, and they say, oh, no, 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 you don't have enough science to show that these natural herbs work, that coconut oil is good for your skin. You can't say that you proved it. But then by the same token, they won't do the randomized control study when it comes to even their vaccines, right? They don't use a true inert placebo, right? So they can't get a signal of harms that are being caused. And so, they're hypocrites when it comes down to it that way. But that bar, these RCTs, they're tens of millions of dollars, right? So if you want to show that, oh, well, look, coconut oil is like the best moisturizer. Well, nobody's got the money to put into that, because nobody's going to make that much money back
Yeah, yeah.
selling
There's
oil
no
without a
there's no
patent.
return on investment, and that's how you can, the really deceitful thing that happens in the industry is that the if a big pharma company knows that one of their products that they've got, $1 billion in research, into, and they know they're going to release this thing, and they're probably going to get through the FDA within a year, 2 years, 3 years, whatever. What they can do is they'll look at the market and they'll see, uh-oh, our product, while it may be better, or maybe as good or not as good or whatever, but there's another product out there already that we're going to be competing with that's already off patent and only costs a couple of pennies a pill, and we're going to have to, compete with that. What they do is they will run around the country with their beautiful young sales reps, and they will offer a whole lot of doctors everywhere $10,000 or $20,000 to study the drug they're going to have to compete with. The classic case was a pain medicine called Darvocet, which is propoxyphene acetaminophen. Very, very widely used, very safe, non-addictive pain medicine. And they went around. They got 1,000 doctors to look at propoxyphene acetaminophen, and see if there are any adverse things happened with their patient population. So out of this 1,000 doctors or whatever, like two doctors came back and said, I think that there were a slight increase in cardiac arrhythmias with the use of this medicine, because my patients with atrial fibrillation seem to have more trouble with their atrial fibrillation. Aha. They take those two studies, those two doctors' reports, they send them to the FDA, and they say, you better look at Darvocet, because these two studies here show that there's an increase in heart rhythm problems. They don't send forward the 998 studies that said, no, we didn't find anything at all. They get killed. The two studies come forward. The FDA looks at it and says, "Wait a minute, there might be a problem with this medicine, Darvocet. We better set it up and see if there's anybody who wants to contradict these studies." Well, everybody in the industry looks at it and says, that drug is a tenth of a penny a pill. I'm not spending any money to go to the FDA to defend Darvocet. Forget that. The FDA doesn't have any contradictory evidence. They therefore ban Darvocet. It gets taken off the market, and the sponsoring pharmaceutical company enters the market with a $7 a pill pain medicine.
That's
And that actually
incredible.
happened. And it
That's
happens all
incredible.
the time.
That's incredible.
That's
Wow, I
how it
hadn't heard that.
works. That's how the game is played. And so now, meanwhile, nobody's complaining because 1,000 doctors got, $5,000, $7,000, $10,000 to run this little study. You know,
Wow.
they, and
Wow.
they did their due diligence. They didn't find anything wrong with the drug. They reported back, but their reports never get reported. It's
Right.
only the ones that found what the pharmaceutical company wanted. That's what gets reported and it gets published. And those two doctors that found that they get sent around the lecture circuit. They said, "Oh, we'll send you to Miami, and you'll talk before this group of cardiologists about your findings that Darvocet causes heart rhythm problems." And so
Wow.
the doctors are very happy. They get a little notoriety, they get a free trip to Miami and a chicken dinner and
Well,
maybe a little
doctor,
stipend.
I want to thank you for coming on today, and I just want to say, yeah, those though we got a big lot of challenges, this is just a human experience. We just got to keep doing the best we can. I just appreciate so much everybody, people like yourself, for speaking the truth. So yeah, let's keep doing that. You got any other closing thoughts?
No, I really appreciate what you guys are doing. I think the better you can spread the good quality information out there. I would advise you and everybody that you speak to on a regular basis, be skeptical. Be very, very skeptical. Follow the money, but always be skeptical.
Doctor, I tell you, so just I say this a lot, but Big Pharma's paid $82 billion in criminal penalties in just the last 12 years, and that excludes vaccines completely. I don't believe a syllable they said. Uh, if they move in their lips, that's how you know they're lying. I don't know. Feels just
Hey, there
about
might be
that
a
bad.
song title in that.
All right. Well, thanks again. Let's talk soon.
Yeah, we'll talk soon. Thank you very much. Really